So now that we have all of our planets set up, everything's got the color on it, or got a shader on it rather, we need to start talking about animation. And this can be a little bit complicated, so we're going to kind of start from the beginning, and we're going to zoom in to a couple of the things right in the center here. So, everything in here is going to be orbiting around the sun, right? But how do we do that? If we zoom into Mercury, or actually let's deal with Venus, it's a little bit bigger. We grab the rotation tool. Right now it rotates around itself, as it should. Well, let me bring up my channel box, that'll make more sense. The pivot point for this, the center for it, is in the center of the planet. We need the planet, though, to traverse around the sun. Now, technically speaking, another option is translate, which would allow us to sort of move this wherever we want. But let's be reasonable. It's moving in an orbit, right? It's moving in a circle, and for us to do that with trying to move it along these three axes, you can, but like why? Why make your life harder? So what we need to do is we need to come up with a way to sort of spin this around this using a rotate tool. And technically you can move this pivot point to somewhere else. We will be going over those sorts of things later. However, if you do that, then you won't be able to spin this. Not that we're going to. You can't tell they're spinning, they're perfect spheres. But theoretically in life you would need to. So what I'm going to show you is a solution to have your cake and eat it too. You're going to be able to rotate this around itself if you wanted to, while also having it orbit around the sun, or technically around the center pivot point here within the sun. There's probably 100 different ways you can do this. This is simply one of them. It kind of teaches us one of the things we need to know. And we're going to do it by grouping things to themselves. So first up, we need to go to Windows, General Editors, Hypergraph, hierarchy. If I say open up the hypergraph, this is what I meant, or this is what I mean. And oh, that's way too big. Sorry, this should not be opening like this. There we go. So we can have multiple windows open at the same time because this program's smart enough to realize if you have this open like this, when I click here, this doesn't hide. I need to see both at the same time in order to show you what's happening. And you may not be able to read these words on here. That's okay. Because you'll be able to at least see conceptually what's happening. So I'm going to take Mercury. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to Edit, Group, but we're not going to hit Control G yet. There are settings, and I want to check them. And this is the settings box. Anything that we use, any tool that we use, if it has settings specific to it, there's a little box right there. I go there, and specifically, I'm looking for a couple things. One, preserve position. Yes, I would like it to stay where it is. Two is, how do we want to, where do we want the pivot point to go? Most times I actually want it to go to the center, right? So if I group this to itself, its pivot point stays where it is. On this rare occasion, though, we actually want these things to orbit around the origin point. We've set up our solar system so that it can orbit around this point, which means we can set this up a little bit faster. So if we leave the group pivot under the origin point and I hit group, this happens. So we get a new group over here. It says group 1, we're going to rename that. Mercury, the planet, is underneath it. And that's what we're looking at right here. This is what we want. This is the concept that we want to get to. Yes, it's a group of one thing. So it seems a little silly to group it, but it gives us this node. These are called transform nodes. It's what you see here in the channel box. Translate, rotate, scale, visibility. Nodes are incredibly important in this program. It's how you connect things to each other. You can see a little tiny line going from here to here. This is indicating that this is underneath this. It's essentially parented to it. So this is the parent, group 1, and Mercury is the child. It means that Mercury can move independently of the group. The group won't move anywhere, but if I move the group, Mercury moves with it. And there's a lot of different ways you can do this, but grouping something to itself is a very quick way to give it a parent with no other stuff in it, which gives you two different pivot points basically. And you can go on and on with this with multiple pivot points, but in this case we just need one. Now, in order to rename this, I need to go up here to my attribute editor. So remember, we've been going back and forth between the channel box and the attribute editor. And when you select group 1, you can see that it's got a name right here. And we're going to call this Mercury Orbit rather than group 1. Don't ever name them group 1, please. And the other thing I want you to see in the attribute editor is that when I click on Mercury, remember, we get all the other stuff. We get the shape, we get a shader, we even get the initial shape because this was made with a primitive, right? All these things that make up the thing that is Mercury. Mercury orbit is only the transform nodes, right? There's nothing else there. There's no shape to it. There's no shader. There's no nothing except what exists underneath it. So it's like a transform node without all the other stuff, right? And that's why we do this. And so if we go to Venus and we hit Control G this time, we don't have to go up to the menu again now that our settings are correct. That groups it to itself. I come up here, the group ends up selected, so I can say Venus shader. Nope, that's not a shader, sorry. Apologies. I was just talking about shaders. All right, and so on and so forth. Now, a few exceptions. One of them is Saturn. We can actually select both things at the same time. Just in here, I just drag select around both, hit Control G, and it'll put them both underneath there. So that's kind of how groups usually work, is that you have multiple things and then you combine them into one group. Also, I should note I'm naming this Saturn orbit, not Saturn group, because you can tell it's a group. It says right here. But I need to know what the group is for. There's a scenario easily where you have multiple groups defining what Saturn does, and so we need to say this one's for the orbit and maybe the other one is for something else. All right, but these two items will both follow this orbit. And the last one that is a little bit funny is the Earth. Actually, I need this to stay over here. Anytime you make a new thing, it comes out to the right-hand side. So how do we do this? Well, first up, we can group the moon to itself because the moon, well, yeah, the moon is going to need to orbit something. And so we're going to call that moon orbit. And yes, I know there would likely be more than one moon in here, so it's a terrible name on my part. And then I click the Earth, and I hit Control G. And I call that Earth orbit. Now, the moon needs to follow the Earth. How do we do this? Well, step one is that it needs to be underneath it. Technically, it has to be underneath the Earth orbit. It needs to orbit when the Earth does. So I don't want it to follow this. I want it to actually follow this. In order to stick one thing under another when you've got multiple things existing already, we middle mouse drag this, the would-be child, and drag it over the would-be parent. And when we do that, we get this scenario where the moon is underneath moon orbit, which will give it a new pivot point, and then it's underneath the Earth. All right, and it might seem a little bit redundant that you have the moon orbit and the Earth here. Like, you could technically tie the moon to the Earth, but then you need to spin the Earth in order to have the moon orbit it, and maybe you wanted to get very technical. The moon doesn't exactly follow exactly where the Earth is. It's not like it's over the same spot every day. So having this separate from this means you could rotate the Earth if you needed to while also giving the moon an orbit. Now the last bit is that we need to change where this is, because very clearly that does not work. So I hit spacebar and I hit the spacebar again to go over here, and we want this to happen in the top view because there's less things that we can accidentally change. Alright, so I select the moon orbit in here just because I can see it's easier. And then, of all things, I hit the insert key on the keyboard. Oh. So for reasons unknown, selecting it here isn't letting me get the pivot point to change. So we're going to select things the other way, which you have to learn anyways. I click on the thing itself that is not the group, and then I hit up on the keyboard. And that gets you the group. And for some reason, when I do it in that order, I can change the pivot point. And then I can click the red arrow because that's the only thing I want to change, and I'm going to slide it over to the Earth. But how do we get this to actually center on the Earth? Eyeballing it is not really an option. Well, there is a form of snapping. So if you hold down X while moving something, you can see it snaps to the grid. This is a very obvious form of snapping. You can see it doesn't go anywhere else except the grids. But if you hold down V while moving something, see that thing turns to a circle. Remember, when we're snapping, it goes from a square to a circle. It will snap to a point. And you're going to want to zoom in a bit to make sure it is actually snapping to the center of this. You want to get a good look at it. But technically what this is called is snap to points, and it moves the selected item to the nearest control vertex or pivot point. So there's a lot of different things going on here that makes up the shape, but you can still get it to pivot on here. And as soon as you click off and click back on, it should, yep, put it back into regular movement mode as opposed to edit pivot mode. So that edit pivot point mode will only show up while, like, just that one time, and then as soon as you start clicking, it goes away. But now we have the moon has its own group that's in the same place as the Earth, which all falls under the Earth orbit. And again, you can walk up this chain by hitting the up key on the keyboard. Do that. Saturn's rings, I select that. Let me zoom out so we can actually see things. If I move up, it gets me the whole group. And that's something you're going to need to be able to do pretty much this whole time. You're going to have to be able to navigate by selecting something and hitting up, because you won't always have your hypergraph open. I just want to get Mars in there. Okay, so we can ignore the outer planets for now. Well, no, we're going to do Jupiter. Control G, makes a group, Jupiter, orbit. You all can do the other two on your own. So we get that set up, and we can close this now because we can navigate without it. We can get to the groups by hitting up on the keyboard. All right. Next up, in order to make this look not boring, we need to not have these planets be so much in a line. Right? This was great for like figuring out distances, because if one's on one side, one's on the other, you can't tell which is closer. But now we need to make this less boring. So, from the top view, because again, it won't mess with other things, we can select Venus and hit up on the keyboard. You're not going to be translating these things, you're going to be rotating them. Hit up on the keyboard to get the Venus orbit group. Hit E to get your rotation tool. And you can rotate it around. If I select Earth and I hit up on the keyboard, I get the Earth tool and do the inside. I'm sorry, I should have specified this. This blue ring, do not ever use it. Next one in, this one, it should only be rotating exactly where you move it. And it should be obvious. Like if you're moving this and things are looking wibbly wobbly, then you're accidentally maybe moving it along the wrong axis. It should only be this inside circle that moves things like this. Again, click on this, hit up to get the group, and you can rotate it around. And this is just for placement. This is just for getting things where we would want them so that they're going to function properly. We're also going to handle Jupiter a little bit. There we go. And I have to zoom out a little. Now that we get to outer planets, you have to keep adjusting how you're working. And you should really make sure to do that. Get used to the fact that you're not going to be able to simply work in one area, right? I can't see the small planets right now. That's okay. I shouldn't be able to always see the small planets, but it does mean that I have to... Hello? Oh, I didn't group these yet. That's right. Okay, we can leave these here for now. So if I want to start working on those again, I have to come back here. And we're going to stay in the top view for a while because it allows us to see things a little bit more clearly and allows us to work without throwing things off the axis. I'm also going to make sure I go back to my channel box because that's where we need to be working. It's what we need to be looking at. Now, one last thing of prep. Well, not really, but one last thing of prep before we go to animation. If I click Mercury and I hit up to get the group, oh wait, I didn't change that one. If I click Venus and I go up to hit up to get the group, I see Venus orbit and the Y is sitting here at 58.939. Well, if we want it to orbit around once, what the heck is the math on that? I certainly don't know. I'm not about to figure it out and add 360 to that insane number each time. No, 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 no. We need this to start at 000 for rotations. Now, I'm going to show you the quick and easy way to do it here. I would recommend you not carry that forward in the future because it's not the best way. It's fine for us right now, but if you ever get to rigging, don't freeze transforms, please. You click the thing that's not a 0, the word for it. You right click and you say freeze and then rotate. All right, so I go to Mars, I hit up, right click, freeze, rotate. And what that's going to do for all of these groups is it's going to take that number that's a little bit unwieldy and it's going to change it from the unwieldy number to a 0. It's freezing transformations means that this is now the origin point for that group. Now, the reason why this is not the best for more advanced things is that you always want to be able to get back to the origin point. And am I going to remember that Saturn's orbit group was rotated to negative 50.73? No. Right? So there are tools in here that let us manage that a little bit better, but they're advanced. So we need to just kind of quick, free transformations, brings everything to 0. And so we can animate from a solid place. So, animation. Oh, got to zoom back in because I can barely see Mercury. Animation is a little bit tricky. So I want you to not click through on this first try because it's actually not going to work. There's 2 settings that are broken. I just want to show you how they're broken because they will always be broken on your computers at the school until you fix them. I don't want to say broken. They're wrong. So I'm going to show you what they look like and then go back and then show you how to animate with them fixed. So I have Mercury here. I hit up to get to this. Animation works like this. This is our timeline. It goes from 0 right now to 120 frames. That's 5 seconds of animation at 24 frames per second. All right, so we have to get used to translating frames into seconds if you function in seconds, as I do, because they are not listed here. Now, 5 seconds isn't a lot, so I'm going to come here to this box and I'm going to say 240 and hit enter. And what that does is it gives me 240 frames to work with and I can see all 240. My time marker is still at frame 1. It says frame 0 over here. There is no frame 0. It starts at 1. And where you are on the timeline is where you place a key. So the order of operations has to be go to the spot on the timeline first, make a change in here, then place a key in here. You place keys in using the channel box so you can be specific. They'll show up down here as little red hash marks, but you place them here because you want to put them on specific things. Don't auto key. Don't put keys on everything. Please, please don't. It's a bad habit. And yeah, it'll be quick now, but it'll be miserable later. Okay. Mercury, orbit. So I look down here at the timeline. I go to frame 1. I go here. Everything is where I want it to be. And then I go up to the rotate Y, which is the only thing we're keying, and I right click and I say key selected. And you'll see a couple things happen. Red box means there's a key on this frame. Red slash means there's a key on this frame, but the red slash could be for any attribute on this. This specifies which one it is. Now, I want Mercury to rotate around 3 times. So 240 divided by 3 is 80. So I go to frame 80. And so again, you change timeline first. And then in order to change this, I'm actually just going to type in the number 360. And you can see how there's like a salmon colored box. It's like a light red box. What that means is that there are keys on this attribute somewhere else in the timeline. So that's the attribute you want to key, but it's not keyed yet. right click, key selected. Right click, key selected is something you are just going to have to get used to and use it a lot because you want to have control of your animation. I go to 160 and another orbit around is 720. So I type in 720, enter, right click, key selected, da, 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 and then 1080, whoops, I go to the end and then 1080, enter, right click, key selected, and then we're going to watch it. Oh, hey, let me go and break it first. Apologies. Figures when I want it broken, it's not broken. Okay, so I put it to where the settings are for the default for the lab, because when you animate something, and this is actually slower than when I had it before, that's going really fast. And if we sit there and we think about it for a second, so 24 frames a second at 240 seconds, that should be 10 seconds. That's not 10 seconds. So we have to go to Window, Settings, Preferences, Preferences. And in particular, we have to go to the time slider. By default, our computers are set to playback speed, play every frame. This is great if you're rendering effects. If you've got a fire effect going, then yeah, render every frame. Cool, great. Not for what we're doing. 24 frames per second times 1. So we have to set that, and then you have to hit save. All right, and you're going to have to do that every time you get to the computer lab because it's not going to save your settings, I don't think. And it might save them to the file, I'm not sure, but it definitely won't save them to the computer. So I'm going to hit play again. Things should go at a much better speed. There we go. Now here's the other thing. You're going to watch it come to a stop. And then it kind of slowly speeds up again. This isn't moving at an even speed. Certainly Mercury does not come to a pause every few Mercury years, right? So this is another problem, and unfortunately this would mean redoing animation, at least in our perspective. So Window, again, Settings, Preferences, Preferences. There's two different things that say Animation Preferences. You want the ones under Settings. So it's Settings, Animation. We're going to go over tangents later. But basically it's how do you interpolate from one keyframe to the other. And right now it's set to auto. There's a lot of times where that's great. Many times where that's great. However, we need linear. Everything we're doing needs to be linear. So we're going to hit save. Now, here's the problem with that. These keys were already made with the wrong tangents. They look like, let me show you in the graph editor. They look like this. It should be a straight line. It's not. Now, if you're comfortable in the graph editor and you want to drag select all your keyframes and hit this little button, this is linear tangents, cool. If not, you'd have to redo the work. But the thing is, you can't change the tangents after the fact through settings. They're already made. And we're going to get into the graph editor later, and especially in 3D too, but for right now, just make sure your tangents are set up properly. So if you have very even animation, like a robot, wheels spinning, conveyor belts moving, gears, whatever, you probably want linear. If you had some kind of character animation, then you might want your default to be spline or auto or flat, maybe, depending on what you're working with. All right. So let's see. If you ever wanted to delete a keyframe, right, you select it in the timeline, right click, delete. I'm not going to delete it now because I don't want to. Oh, and when I unselect Mercury, all the red flashes go away because they're on the Mercury orbit. So the red slashes only show up for things you actually have selected. All right. And then you can repeat that process. I'll show it again. I click Venus, I hit up on the keyboard, go to frame 0, make sure it's at 0, right click, key selected. I'm only going to have Venus orbit around twice. Doesn't orbit as fast as Mercury, although I should mention I am kind of making these numbers up. I do not technically know how fast Mercury goes, so I went to 120 frame, changes to 360, right click, key selected, go to 240, change this to 720. Right click, key selected. And you could probably do that same amount for Mars, right? It doesn't have to spin super fast the way Mercury does, just going to orbit a little bit. And we should be able to see, yep, Mercury orbiting faster than Venus does. And we should also see, since it's looping, we shouldn't see any weird pauses. Yep, it should just seamlessly go from one place to the next. That's the dream. All right, how to work with Earth and the Moon. Oh, before I get to that, I should mention if you are working on Saturn, it's literally the same thing. You select one of the items, you hit up to get to the group, same process. It doesn't matter that there's multiple things rotating around. You're technically rotating a group, and what it contains is going to rotate around with it. If you have anything that has a moon on it, so if you're looking to add moons to stuff on the homework, I would recommend setting up the moons first and then doing your orbits for that stuff because it's just easier to see what's going on. So I select the moon, I hit up on the keyboard, and then I decide how many times I want the moon to fly around. So I go to frame 1, I make sure to key it at 0. Well, I would do it 4 times, so 60. So 240 divided by 4 is 60. And so yes, that does mean I have to type in the number 360. And then at 120, it has to be 720. You're going to learn your 360 timetables pretty well while doing this assignment. 1080. Right-click key selected, and I can check that they're all in there. I can also check. Ooh, something just flew by. There it is. There, and then I'm going to do a last bit of math that I hadn't done yet. 360 plus 1080. 1440. I should have known that. So I go to the last frame and I type in 1440. And I say key selected. All right, beautiful. Set up the moon first as if this is a planet and this is the sun. And then zoom out, click on the Earth, select that orbit, and deal with this separately, right? So you should take one and then the other and do the child stuff first, then do the parenty stuff. So if I go to Windows, oh my gosh, I never remember where these are. Hypergraph hierarchy. If you have something with multiple steps, the way the Earth orbit is, set up this and then set up this. It's just easier. You'll be able to see what you're doing faster. Also, look at all these little slanted trapezoids or rhombuses or whatever they're called. They have animation on them. So it's telling you that these have keys. That is what I have animated so far. So they're not broken. All right. But yeah, once I animate the Earth, key selected, I'm having it go around twice. 360. Go to the bottom. Oh, make sure I'm on the right frame. Nope, that's not the right number. 720. Key selected. And what that will mean is that the moon, although we can barely tell because technically they're both rotating in the same direction, but yeah, you can see the moon orbiting around the Earth, which now orbits around the sun, etc. And if you want to see what it looks like in the 3rd dimension, all right, you can start to see it here. And then once you get the outer planets going maybe once around every 240 frames, it can start to look really cool. It's not like an actual full orbit around the sun because none of these things are timed the same or even in league with each other. Mercury doesn't go around 3 times to Earth's 1, right? They're not in sync like that. But in order to do that, you'd have to have this run for a very long time, and you'd have to set them up in a certain way to have off-kilter amounts of orbits. So don't worry about that, right? We just want to get some animation in. All right, and one last thing that I want to go over, because if I don't, professionals in this program will hunt me down. Windows Outliner. So we were looking at the nodes of what made this through the hypergraph. And that is what I teach with, in part because they're very large boxes that we can see. The structure is very obvious, and we're working with something that's pretty simple. However, this is a giant box that's in the way, right? The outliner is basically the same thing, but in this nifty little like layers box almost. It's a little less intrusive. It can run, especially on a large monitor, it can run over here while you do all your stuff over here, and it doesn't get in the way as much. And the way it works is that you can see each of the things, they're kind of glumped together by default. You have to press these little plus boxes, and it'll show them. And if I click the moon, there we go. So it's a similar look. It's this, moves into this, is at the same level as this, which goes into that. So you can still see the hierarchy. I think it's even in the same order as in the hypergraph. Yeah, because this is the order I created them in. And I think you can display, organize layers, sort order, scene hierarchy, or alphabetical within type. So you can put these in a better order so that you can find things alphabetically. But this is used by professionals so much. You can search, if you have lots and lots and lots of things, you can search for a particular thing. You can tell it to show only, right now it's on show all, but you can tell it to show only polygon objects, or you can tell it to show only joints. Like you got rid of all the cameras, right? I don't care about the cameras. I'm not using them right now. So you can also get used to this. So when we're first starting out, we are going to use the hypergraph just because it's easier to see on the projector these boxes and what's happening, but you're going to want to get used to looking at the outliner. They're very, very similar.